Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today we shall be discussing the problem with learning languages. Now, learning languages is an important skill. Uh, you can learn other cultures, you can speak to other people, you can have that culture be within you at all times. Uh, and you can also understand the world better. Now, what is a language itself? It's a different way to communicate ideas to the world, a different way to express yourself. It's a change in your ideas and your thoughts. Um, in every language you learn, those ideas you can create different ideas and express yourselves in better ways. But there's a problem with learning language, and a lot of people see it as a difficulty to overcome. You might spend some time learning a language, and then you'll just not have any time to practice with it. So you begin to forget things because you don't have to use it. You don't see a value in practicing, and you wonder, hey, why are my language skills diminishing? Well, there's a lot of things that go into learning a language, but I've narrowed it down to four. The first one I would like to talk to you about is syntax. Now, that is how you put together a sentence or a phrase or whatever you're trying to say. So, you you like in what I'm saying right now, I'm putting ideas together in a certain way that they make sense. I'm also putting them in a way that is the most common way. Uh, if you know Yoda from Star Wars, he has a different syntax to everyone else. He puts verbs in front. So he says, know you, I do, instead of I know you. And that's a change in syntax, and we can perceive that change. And that is why most people don't do that. But over time, over millennia, over generations, syntax can change. And we've seen that with the change of Old Latin, into the Neo Latin languages, which are Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, all those languages. Also, you can see that with the Germanic languages, how English is a lot different than Dutch, German, or the Scandinavian languages. Um, but that being said, syntax can change, but it's a thing that can be understood within your own language, as long as the syntax isn't so far out that it makes it impossible to communicate ideas. Um, what you could do to learn syntax better is try translating the words literally in another language, or the not the words, but the phrase itself literally into your language, if it's a close enough language, and then you can see how that sentence is put together. So you can understand exactly how you can put that sentence together in the language that you're learning. I would say you should do this for European languages, mostly. If your native language is English, you should do this for European languages, and I would stick mostly with doing that with Germanic languages and the Romance languages, the Neo-Latin languages, um, because those are the closest ones to our speech. There is also number two, morphosyntax. Now, morphosyntax is just a fancy name for grammar. It's the change in syntax. Basically, grammar is in every language family, like the Germanic languages or the Romance languages or any other language family. Languages share properties. They share how they can change words, how they can make verbs turn into other verbs, like which is called conjugation. They can basically show you how you change the meanings of a sentence. And the thing about grammar is that although it is hard to reproduce grammar in another language, outside of a language family. So if you're learning a Germanic language and you speak a Germanic language, it should be easier to reproduce that grammar within your own language. It's harder if you're trying to learn something like the Romance languages or a Slavic language like Russian or something. It's not easy to use their grammar within your own language because it won't make sense. But if you want to if you want to learn how to use grammar, my suggestion to you is that you just use repetition on it. Over time, your brain will start to understand the patterns that are within grammar. And that's basically what grammar is. It's just patterns that are used for creating thought. And it doesn't take very long because, see, uh, instead of syntax, morphosyntax, grammar is finite. So you only have so many things you can do to change a word within the language. Um, and that's how languages stay consistent within their family. Um, so basically, just learn the grammar as best you can within the language, and it just requires repetition. Just repetition, repetition, repetition. That is the main thing to learn grammar of another language. But grammar is not the largest or the most important thing in a language. See, you could speak English without having much grammar. You just need to understand syntax. So, dog be there is understood as the dog is there. If you can understand that shows how a lack of grammar factors into understanding a language. Now, the third thing is vocabulary. Now, in that example where dog be there, you have different verbs, you have different words, you have all the verbiage there that when it comes together with the syntax, it makes a thought. You don't need to have the grammar to make the thought, but you need to have the words and you need to have the syntax to make the thought. And basically, words and lexemes and things like that, they exist uniquely in different languages. Sometimes languages share a great deal of vocabulary. English, for example, has 60% of its vocabulary that comes from Latin, whether it be French or Latin itself. And that means that you can understand a great deal of Latin and you can understand a great deal of French. But if you don't understand the syntax of French or Latin, it'll be hard. And that's also a problem that sometimes you can't recognize the vocabulary within other languages. Sometimes you might understand a word in another language if they spell it closely enough to what it is in English, but a lot of times they don't. See, that is a problem of the fourth thing I'm going to talk about, phonology. See, grammar, syntax, and words, they all change over time, but phonology is the fastest. That's because how people speak, it changes based on accents and how far people live. Back in the old days, because people lived so far away, their accents began to diverge. When people came to the Americas, you would have a big area, a great large area of a certain accent, and that's what we're seeing today, like a Southern accent or Northern accent or a Minnesotan accent from the United States accents. You can see that from accents in Canada. You can see that from accents in Britain. And in Britain, they have so many different accents. There's no one British accent. They have hundreds of accents because these people were divided for so long and they were able to develop their own accents. Some of them are almost unintelligible to us Americans, but we usually don't see those because they're more the accents of the poor people. But phonology and the change in sounds over time and the change in how you write a language is a great factor in intelligibility of another language. If somebody let's take the example of Portuguese and Spanish. Now, Portuguese and Spanish are very understandable between each other if you can see it written. This is great if you want to write to each other, but the problem with Portuguese is that they've developed an accent that is too different from that of Spanish that it is increasingly difficult for Spanish people to understand somebody that speaks Portuguese. For Portuguese people, the realm of Spanish is less of a problem because those sound qualities exist in Portuguese. They're just not used as much. But in Spanish, those sound qualities never exist because they're expecting to hear only a certain amount of sounds. In English, when we try to understand another language, we also have that problem because well, we're going to go back to the ideas of vocabulary. If you're going to go to Germany, you might be able to understand some things, but their phonology and their writing is a lot different. You might understand that haben means have, but there are also words out there like übersetzen, which in English would be overset. In Scandinavian languages, they say overset, but we don't say overset, we say translate, because that comes from a Latin word that we use. We would rather use a Romance language vocabulary for that instance, and if you were to tell somebody, overset this please, they wouldn't understand what you're talking about because that word is not heavily used in your language, in English, but it is used very much in German. They say, I am called, they say, ich heiße. In English, they have the word height. I height Andrew. I height Andrew Earthrise. But we don't use that. We use more commonly, I am called. And if you don't understand the verb, the word, and if you don't understand, and you don't know how to read it as that same word, it's going to be hard to understand the language. We can also see that in Spanish and English. So let's say Spanish for to speak is hablar. Now this comes from the word fablar, which means to fable. And in French would be fabler. But the thing about it is that those words don't make sense to us because we don't say fable as to speak. But the Spanish and the Portuguese do. In Portugal, they say falar. In Spain, they say hablar. And those are phonological changes. They also write them differently. And that causes problems for people to understand each other. See, most of the continental Romance languages are very intelligible to each other. But the problem is, they don't use all of the same vocabulary. They also have different phonologies. This includes French. French, Spanish, and Portuguese, they share a lot of vocabulary. A lot of it. Sometimes French has its own vocabulary, and that's due to its own phonology. Also, it has its own syntax due to its own phonology, but that's a video on its own. And it creates so much difference between all the languages that they're not intelligible, very intelligible. They're not understandable, and it makes learning those languages so much longer than they have to be. Now, if you didn't know this, I actually speak Latin. I can understand and write Latin. I can read Latin, and I can speak it. Ego possum fabulare Latinum. But the thing about Latin is that it has all the vocabulary across all the languages. So for me, when I'm reading something in French, when I'm reading something in Spanish or Portuguese, if it's not evident close enough, if I look into the etymology of the word, I'll be able to understand what a word means. So let's say you have a word like canine in English. Well, in all of the languages, all of the Neo-Latin languages, there's a variation of that. Spanish, you say can, but they say perro more. In Spanish, that means hound. In Portuguese, they say cão. In French, they say chien. That's a change in phonology. They say in Italian, cane, and in Romanian, caine. No, those all sound similar, but they're not similar enough to be understood if you hear them across the languages. French especially sounds the most different, but if you read it and you understand what it means, it is intelligible between all of them, and that's exactly how I learned the Romance languages so fast. I could understand the different words that they use within each other that coalesce and that are very common. So I understand how to put a sentence together. I understand how to um, I understand how syntax works because it's basically the same syntax as Latin, not ancient Latin, because ancient Latin syntax is very different. And when I say ancient Latin, I mean classical Latin. That's not the type of Latin you want to that you would want to learn. Vocabulary in ancient Latin, that's completely different than the kind of Latin that I'm talking about when I'm speaking about learning languages. Because a Latin that I understand, um, it is what we in English use a lot of times with our fancy words. So if you understand a lot of fancy words in English, if you say I can fable very well French, I can fable Portuguese, I can fable Spanish, over time you'll understand the words and you'll be able to put sentences together. Um, but remember those four things. Just get syntax, learn a lot of syntax for making words and phrases, and learn grammar. Grammar doesn't take a lot of time, it just takes a lot of repetition. You'll Once you get all the grammar, you'll understand how to communicate in the right way, past tense, future tense, whatever you need to do. um, Three is it's vocabulary. You need to have a good enough vocabulary to learn, and if your language is close enough to English, I would suggest learning the cognates in English for your verbs, so that you can use those verbs in English, so that you can understand them better. And if there's vocabulary that is shared between the languages, which in Germanic and Latin languages, they share a lot of vocabulary. It just requires some etymology hunting. And then fourth, phonology. Now, the best way to learn phonology, um, it would be to develop an accent. I would say that's a great way to do it. If you can develop an accent, you can pronounce words pretty well. Let me explain. Let me show you something like in British English. Hi, I'm a person from Britain. Now, see, that's a different phonology, but it's understandable. And if you can pronounce words like that, you can do the same thing in another language, and that'll help your phonology. Um, so those are my recommendations, and for if you could comment, tell me what language you're learning or what problems you're having specifically, that'd be great. Like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you. Bye bye.